Consciousness refers to the level of awareness of our internal and external surroundings. So it exists within a continuum that goes all the way from total awareness to complete lack of awareness. So we know that it's on a continuum because it's difficult to differentiate some of these distinct stages as to where we would be. Within awareness falls focused attention right at the top here, which is characterized by high levels of concentration. And so the fact if you're able to pay attention to something, it's a good way to understand awareness within normal waking consciousness. An altered state of consciousness is any state of consciousness that's like clearly different from normal waking consciousness in terms of those levels of awareness. Altered states of consciousness can occur naturally, such as sleep or daydreaming, or they can be induced, with the key word there being purposeful, such as alcohol-induced or intoxicated, drug-induced, hypnosis, or a coma. So you need to remember these different levels of awareness within the continuum from normal waking consciousness all the way to altered states of consciousness. Here's a past exam question that asks about, illustrates the best sequence from being the most aware all the way to the least aware, with the answer here being D, so focusing on an exam question. So something that requires attention, awareness, being drowsy, fainted, and being in an induced coma. So always think back to consciousness in terms of the level of awareness of internal and external environments. Next dot point that we had a look at is all about psychological states due to different levels of awareness and characteristics to be able to compare and differentiate between normal waking and altered states of consciousness. So biggest difference is going to come from awareness, with being people in normal waking consciousness tend to have higher levels of awareness than people in altered states of consciousness, as we have explored so far. So controlled and automatic processes are something that is going to differ between these two. And a controlled process is something that requires conscious and alert awareness and mental effort, with an individual focusing on achieving a particular goal. So when we're referring to a controlled process, we're talking about the level of concentration that is required. Whereas an automatic process requires little conscious effort and doesn't affect the performance of other activities. So they're generally used when a task is familiar or when it is very simple. We need to understand the term attention and how it exists within controlled and automatic processes. So there are three different types of attention that we're going to have a look at. The first one being selective attention. So this is when the individual can attend to one specific stimuli and ignore others. So this would generally fall under being a controlled process in the fact that it is purposeful and requires a lot of concentration to do so. We then have divided attention, where an individual can distribute their attention across multiple different things and complete those tasks simultaneously and completing them at the same time. We are able to divide our attention between two automatic processes, or perhaps one controlled and one automatic process. People in an altered state of consciousness will generally struggle being able to be able to selectively divide our attention. Over time, controlled processes can become automatic processes as things, as we get better of them, don't require that same amount of effort over time. And this was the example that we saw in that checkpoints question about playing the guitar. Just be careful and take note if the question's asking you about neural plasticity, or if it's talking about levels of processing, which is what we're looking at here in terms of controlled and automatic processing. So in an alcohol-induced state, for example, things that were previously automatic processes, so things that didn't require huge amounts of effort or concentration, can become controlled, therefore requiring that extra effort or having to focus and concentrate to perform these tasks. So some things like speaking or walking could become controlled. Remember that sleep is only can be an automatic process because we know that we can't do anything in terms of dividing or selecting our attention when we sleep. So by definition, control processes require focused attention and mental effort to complete, whereas automatic processes require very little attention. So when we're asked to differentiate between normal waking consciousness and altered state of consciousness, these are the psychological characteristics and parameters that we're going to look at to separate them from each other. So the first one being content limitations. So these are the levels of control in what we allow into our consciousness. So in normal waking consciousness, generally people have more restricted, so therefore more limited, than a person in an altered state of consciousness. An example of that could be your thought patterns and things that are entering your consciousness stream. So they're usually more restricted in normal waking than altered states. Perceptual and cognitive distortions, while they are different things, they are quite interrelated in terms of what they're dealing with. So these are talking about changes or in our experience or in our thinking that doesn't correspond with reality. So for example, in an alcohol-induced state, we experience some impaired awareness or perhaps of reality or memory or decision making. All of these things can be distorted. Emotional awareness is the next one, and this is basically our control of our experience within our emotions and our emotional reactions. So in normal waking consciousness, emotions are generally stable and quite predictable. However, during altered states of consciousness, people can become way more or way less emotional. Have a think about drunk people getting really angry and getting into bar fights and stuff. Oh, I did it because I was drunk, is a good example. Self-control. So this is our ability, and kind of interrelates with that emotional awareness there, our ability to manage ourselves physically and emotionally in terms of our movements and in our actions. In an altered state of consciousness, people have a lot less control over these things. So you might stumble when you're walking, if we're talking about those physical things. And time orientation. So this is just understanding the difference between our sense of the speed of time that is passing. So in an altered state of consciousness, time can speed up or it can slow down. So when we're sleeping, for example, time usually appears to pass very quickly. Whereas when we're in normal waking consciousness, we have a bit more of a clear sense of time that is passing. So remember, whenever you are asked about the psychological characteristics, these are the ones that it is referred to. So controlled processes coming and awareness are a little bit more challenging, but these ones, I want you to pick your favorite one out of these. That's going to be one always with an example ready to go, which we've done lots of tables and work on so far. And here's just a nice little table that summarizes all of those things I just said. So, David is in an alcohol-induced state of consciousness at a party. It is likely that the content of David's thoughts are less restricted than in normal waking consciousness, and selective attention is possible. More restricted than normal waking consciousness, and selective attention is unlikely. Less restricted than in normal waking consciousness, and selective attention is unlikely. More restricted than in normal waking consciousness, and selective attention is possible. So you can already see that the answer is going to be C. But when we're talking about content limitations, So that's where the term about being restricted there, are more limited in normal waking consciousness, which we can see by the first half here. So they're not more restricted, they are, less restricted in normal waking consciousness. Meaning that you can allow your thoughts to change really quickly, or jump between different things, say things that you don't mean in those altered states of consciousness. And selective attention is much more difficult to achieve in an altered state of consciousness, making C the answer. So we're going to have a look now at the measurement of some physiological responses to indicate different states of consciousness. So the first one being these physiological states. So the 3 E's that we have looked at, we've looked at an EEG, where we need to remember to always use the acronym DARE. So it detects, amplifies, and records electrical activity of the brain. So basically an EEG is going to measure brain waves. You need to understand how this is done as well, by using a cap of electrodes that are placed on participants' head. Next one being an EMG, which is a device that detects, amplifies, and records the electrical activity of the muscles. So it measures muscle movement and tension, but this is done through electrical activity. So anytime there is movement within the muscles, they generate this activity, and this is what the device records. Same goes for the EOG. So need to remember M there for muscle, and O there you can think of like ocular or occipital being the eyes. And it controls the activity of the muscles around the eyes. So not the eyes specifically, but the muscles around them, so we can pay attention to those patterns of movements around, similar to when we're looking at REM. So different brain waves that are being measured are characterized by frequency. So this is how often do they occur, and amplitude, the size or the intensity of those waves. So in normal waking consciousness, high frequency and low amplitude waves are present when we're awake. And in the deepest of all sleeps, it is low frequency with high amplitude waves they're being characterized. So see those differences here. So frequency, how often and how close together, and amplitude, the size of the wave, so how high they are going. Now, next method is measurement of speed and accuracy on cognitive tasks. This is psychological. It is psychological, I can't spell. It is not physiological like this one, because these are recording bodily movements and patterns. So these are physical, whereas this is psychological. Please make sure you understand that differentiation, because a lot of people in their checkpoint drill seem to get confused a little bit by that method. So when we're talking about measurement of speed and accuracy on a cognitive task, we just mean anything that involves learning, memory, or spatial processing, decision making as well. So there's an inverse relationship between speed and accuracy, particularly in altered state of consciousness. So the faster that things happen, the less accurate you are going to be. So this is considered to be an objective measure, as it can be quantitative and easily free from bias based on those results. We've also looked at some subjective measures as well. So these are things that no one else has external access to. So subjective measures being your personal experiences or how you're feeling. So yes, we can record them by using self-reports, but they tend to be less accurate than objective measures. So the most common form we've had a look at is a sleep diary, but these can differ and not be consistent from person to person. Now, the next one is video monitoring. It's really important to understand that video monitoring does fall under these subjective methods. And this is used during sleep studies so that we can record and have a look at things such as movement, tossing, turning, night terrors, perhaps waking up. So it's confused as being objective because, well, there's a camera that records it. That's free from bias. However, it's within the interpretation of that content that it becomes subjective from the people talking about what they're viewing. So let's have a look at a Vika question from 2009. I can't even say his name. Plinio visited a sleep lab for the night. In the laboratory, a number of physiological measures were taken. Okay, physiological. So we're going to talk about those 3 E's, those body E's. That were taken. The measures included an EOG and an EEG. Notice it's likely that you're always going to get them there. You're not going to have to write out the full words. So what does an EOG measure and what does an EEG measure? Answers here came that you cannot say eye muscles. You have to say muscles that control eye movements, because they're not the muscles in the eye, they're the muscles around the eye. The EEG detects, amplifies, and records electrical activity of the brain. So without using the word electrical, responses were not recorded there. So the average was 0.4 for 1 mark there, sorry.